So the Rambam assumed that that gap cannot be there because it must be so that if Torah is divine revelation, if it really has deep wisdom, it has to match, it has to resonate with our experience and observation. We are living in an age of great ferment and upheaval. While we may hope for models from the past which we can simply apply to resolve our confusion, it soon becomes evident that no such models exist. Still, it is useful to remind ourselves that this is not the first time in which people needed a new guide for the perplexed and the confused. Nor as we continue to grow in awareness with God's help, will this be the last time. Our task here is to try and map a credible Jewish credo for this moment. And by moment, we're talking about moment in history. If this effort turns out to be helpful, then I will be pleased. Spiritually, an age such as this one is characterized by a vast array of new questions. The very fact that the old models do not apply directly is itself a sign that we need to be asking new questions. But when we look carefully, we find that these new questions often do have antecedents. Examining and appreciating them can be helpful in shaping some tentative answers for our own time. In an age of ferment and upheaval, it is far more difficult and far more important to find real questions than to insist upon correct answers. And I feel that this is so crucial, so essential to the book. I'm going to read the sentence one more time. It is far more difficult and more important to find real questions than to insist upon correct answers. In the end, the best answers will come from long and diligent thinking and research, from further revelation from the source of truth, capital S, capital T, or some combination of the two. But even revelation is more likely to come to those who have learned to raise the appropriate questions. Answers which speak directly to the moment in which the questions are being addressed are more likely to come to those who are vitally hungry for their questions to be answered. Are you hungry? Are you and I vitally hungry? So let me just say at this point, we just started reading the book, that the book is written by very honest spiritual seekers. Rabbi Zalman Schachter Shalomi, who grew up in Orthodoxy, in the most conservative, environment in amongst our people, and so was Rabbi Daniel Siegel. Both were seekers enough, were hungry enough. When they talk about this hunger, they're talking about their own experience, and they're really talking to you and I, who are hungry enough and have deep questions and are committed to exploring those answers. I think it's really essential. Honestly, if being a seeker is not you, if you want pat answers, this book is probably not for you. An antecedent, Maimonides' Guide for the Perplexed. So here Reb Zalman is going to talk about how Maimonides, the Rambam, Rabbi Moses, the son of Maimon, a 12th century great rabbi, who himself, when he wrote his books, Mishnah Torah, Guide for the Perplexed, and so many other works, that he himself was a seeker at his time, looking for the answers that would be fitting and fresh for his time in the 12th century. And apropos, the Rambam, who's a classic now, was controversial. Was actually he was outcast. He was ostracized in his own time. The Rambam, Maimonides, wrote this book, A Guide for the Perplexed, for a specific person. The perplexed one for whom he wrote this book was a man whose name was Yosef ibn Achnin. Ibn Achnin's reality map was based on Aristotle's, and he had written the Rambam with the questions he now had about how to read Torah in light of Aristotle. And you can see that in our days when we're reading about modern theoretical physics, about quantum mechanics and string theory and the antimatter and the cutting edges of modern physics and philosophy, we ask the question of how do we read Torah through the lens of the wisdom of our time. We know that the Rambam had a very heavy and pressing daily schedule because he once wrote a letter in which he described his daily routine. He said that he rose early each morning, he davened or prayed, and taught the congregation for a while. Then he would go to the Sultan's palace, where he was required to inspect all the parties of the Sultan's harem, because that was the first indication in those days of disease. The Rambam was a doctor. A sort of early urinalysis. At the end of his work day at the Sultan's palace, he dealt with questions from Jewish community over which he presided. Despite his schedule, the Rambam was happy to receive these questions from Ibn Achnin. Apropos, the Rambam was born in Spain. This is during the golden age of Spain, where Jews flourished, very similar to how we Jews are here in America. And then his family immigrated to Egypt. He actually lived in Cairo, where he became the physician of the Sultan, the leader of the Muslim empire of that time. So Ibn Achnin wrote him and said that it wouldn't pay for him to come and visit because of this schedule, but that he would write him a response. Writing this response was important enough that the Rambam found the time to compose this lengthy and comprehensive book, which provided a modern, quote-unquote, reformulation of Judaism in light of Aristotelian philosophy. And just parenthetically, if you're not familiar with Aristotle and Aristotelian philosophy, it was the rationalism of the time. Aristotle really laid the foundation for philosophical Greek and Roman philosophical logic that is the foundation of Western civilization as we know it, really. Why did he do it? Why did a man who already was the leader, teacher, and emissary of the Jewish community in his generation, who was as well the physician of the royal court, take the time to write a long and difficult work in response to what were essentially elementary questions? The reason is that he believed that no one had yet explained to the people of that time in a mature way what Yiddishkeit, or Judaism, was all about. Apropos, Yiddishkeit is tongue in cheek, because there was no Yiddish per se at that time, or maybe Yiddish was brand new in the Middle Ages. And he is living in the Muslim world, so Yiddish was not the language in among Sephardi Jews. Yiddish was really a mix of German and Hebrew that was used primarily in the European sphere. So this wasn't Yiddishkeit. This was Judaism of that time. To a person of the Rambam's philosophical sophistication, nothing that had been written during that period seemed to represent Judaism in an intellectually respectable way. Essentially, the Rambam began with the following premise, which I call giving Torah the benefit of the doubt. He said, given that the Torah has its origin in divine revelation, it is impossible for it to be shallow or to contradict the deepest truths we learn from experience and observation. This is so crucial. Let's hear that again, because really the whole enterprise of rabbinic Judaism, of rabbinic interpretation, is based on that assumption. So here we go. Given that the Torah has its origin in divine revelation, it is impossible for it to be shallow or to contradict the deepest truths we learn from experience and observation. And isn't that where we get the most disappointed with Torah, when we're trying to reconcile our logic, our intuition, our life experience, and the wisdom that makes sense to us with the stories of Torah and with the values of Torah and what seems like the authenticity of Torah and what could seem as the irrelevancy of Torah. So the Rambam assumed that gap cannot be there, because it must be so that if Torah is divine revelation, if it really has deep wisdom, it has to match, it has to resonate with our experience and observation. However, if I continue to interpret it in the way that it is commonly understood, then Torah ends up looking primitive in relation to the knowledge we are gaining through observation and experience. But since Torah cannot be foolishness, it follows that we need to find new ways to interpret Torah which make more sense today. And obviously it's the obligation of every generation, including our own, to do exactly that. The Rambam realized that the questions he was being asked concerning how certain passages in the Torah were to be understood in light of philosophy and science needed to be addressed. Otherwise, Yiddishkeit would not be a credible religion. So this is a good subchapter. I think that it's a wonderful way of laying the grounds for a courageous exploration that you and I will take together as we go through the book. This is page 3, and we're aiming at reading all the way through to page 387. I'm sorry, I'm being a little short here. Actually, 394. So we have 391 more pages to read through, and this just lays the groundwork. How can we analyze Torah in light of the wisdom that we observe and experience today that would reconcile the gap and give us an authentic connection to our story of origin and sacred text. Every so often, the zeitgeist, spirit of the times, raises questions which demand answers. If we approach these questions academically, we begin by asking, what were the old questions and how were they answered? For example, the old questions included, and here's a list, how do we know there is a God? What is the nature of God? Does God have positive attributes, or can we only ascribe negative qualities to God? Beginning with this last question, supposing we say that God is holy or God is great. These attributes are applied to God following our observation of them in the human reality. However, human beings who are holy or are great achieve these attributes only for limited times within limited lives. Therefore, when they are applied to God, they imply a larger quantity of time and longer consistency. Still, even vast quantities of time and great consistency limit the infinity of God, usually postulated as part of the answer to the second question above. What is the nature of God? So in other words, if we say anything about God, even if we say that God is holy and God is great, aren't those qualifications actually limiting God to something that is temporal and finite? You see, that is a question that Reb Zalman is offering, which Maimonides asked. How can you say that about God? How can you say anything about God that makes any sense using human language if the only thing that we can really describe from experience has temporality and or finality to it? So when the Rambam formulated his response to this question, he argued that we can apply only negative attributes to God. Rather than saying God is good, we can properly say only that God is not evil. And here, negativity and positivity can be misunderstood. This is really talking about affirmative versus non-affirmative, I would say, right? Right. So we can only say use non-affirmative qualifications about God, according to the Rambam. Apropos, that's pretty controversial, because the Torah herself attributes a lot of constructive, a lot of affirmative qualities to God, right? God gets angry. God is, God is mighty. God has an outstretched hand. A lot of anthropomorphic imagery in the Torah, and the Rambam says none of that can really work. The only thing we can say is that God is the absence of anything that we can describe and or perceive in human reality. Let us continue. The questions, as framed by Ibn Achnin, were the ones that spoke to the deep inner place which impelled his quest. To us, however, these questions and their answers may satisfy an intellectual curiosity, but they are not likely to satisfy our version of that very deep place in our own souls, which hungers for truth and demands a response that relates to our own experience. So you see that he's pointing out to the fact that the intellectualism in the 12th century was not the same intellectualism of the 21st century. The questions we're asking today are different. It comes from a different worldview that's evolved over the course of really 900 years now. And what Rav Zalman here is qualifying, which is interesting, and this is open for, I'd love to hear your thoughts on that. But to him, he's claiming that for us, in our time, our intellectualism, our questioning is related to our personal experience. Not so in the Middle Ages. In the Middle Ages, it was more of a third person, more of an objectifying interaction or perception with reality. Right? For the medievals, God was an external entity. For us, it has to be subjective. We've developed into a place where personal experience takes much more of a priority, of a weightiness in our thinking than medieval folks. So at this point, what do you think? What are the questions of our time? What are your questions about the Torah's relevancy or irrelevancy? Maybe not about the whole Torah, but specific questions, specific issues. For instance, the parsha this week is of the red heifer that's being burnt as to create a purification potion. Is that relevant to our times? How do we reconcile that with the reality in which we don't do sacrifices at all? And so on and so forth. What is the gap that you need to close to connect to the flow, assuming that the flow is there, the vibrancy and the relevancy of a Jewish tradition for you? Leave comments below. Let's continue the conversation offline. I'd be happy to interact and to connect with you in the comment section. If you're watching on YouTube, please like and subscribe. For now, shalom, and I look forward to meeting you again at our next session. We'll be reading from Credo of a Modern Kabbalist once a week here on our channel, Hebrew Learning Circles. Shalom for now.